Welcome to VCR, Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I admire its purity. A survivor, unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality.
All right, thanks, Ash.
You're welcome. I have a lot to say about Ash, by the way.
So here's the thing. We're doing the Alien deep dive episode. This is the spoiler-full discussion that we're going to be heading right into. If you've never seen the movie Alien from 1979, go back and check the primer episode out where we talk about it spoiler-free. That said, out of the way, Ash is maybe the best addition to this movie that has ever been added by
A studio?
a studio.
Yeah. So why don't we just jump right into Ash? Are you okay with that?
Yeah, I
Okay.
am fully ready to talk lots about Ash.
So just a little reminder for those at home. Of these 7 characters, there is Ash, the science officer, and he's a little creepy and off-putting, right?
Good on Ian Holm for really leaning into that, eh?
Yeah, and it's very subtle at first, there is that great moment where the crew members come back to the ship and John Hurt has been face hugged,
Mhm.
and again, as a new viewer, you don't even really know that Ripley is the main character at this point.
Yeah.
But she's very much like, hey, no, I can't let you guys back in. Like, that's an unknown.
Very reasonable.
Yeah, that's an unknown organism, and it could infect the entire ship.
Yeah.
Ash goes over her head and lets them in.
Yeah.
And it's, your first time watching this movie, you're a little conflicted about it because, think about it. Think about your friend is outside and your boss doesn't want to let them back in, even though their life is in danger. So Ash almost kind of comes out of that looking like the hero.
Well, and on the flip side of that as well, we're also experiencing this as a movie, as viewers of a movie.
Yes.
And we're watching this knowing that it's a horror movie. And so us as viewers are like, well, that was really dumb. And immediately when you're watching a horror movie and a character does a dumb decision, you get kind of mad.
Right.
But the way that Ian Holm plays it off, there's always something going on with Ian Holm. Like, his facial expressions are part of what sells his character so well and some of the ideas of who he is as a character.
Right. And there's that great interaction where Ripley kind of confronts him about this and says, I'm acting.
Yeah.
I was the acting, captain of the ship, and I said no, they couldn't come in, and you went over my head. And he just says something very dismissive, like, well, Ripley, you do your job and let me do mine, right? And then there's all these moments, and you almost don't catch them on a first viewing, of him undermining the crew.
Undermining the crew, the glances that he has, every once in a while, the camera will either pan over to him while everybody else is reacting, and his reaction is always just, slightly different from everybody else's.
A little muted, right?
Yeah.
And, there's even that moment when they're trying to determine how to get the face hugger off John Hurt, and doesn't somebody say, let's just throw him in stasis so we get back to Earth? And he's just like, no, I want to see, I want to get this thing off it.
Right.
I don't remember exactly what he says, but it's something like that.
Yeah, he just has this curiosity that's for this alien life form that's a little different from everybody else. But his character, I would almost compare to a Hannibal Lecter. There's something really behind the eyes that's just present throughout Ian Holm's performance in this one. I legitimately think this is probably the best performance of the entire movie is Ian Holm's character.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as we go on throughout this film and the sinister part of the plot is revealed that he is actually an android,
mm-hmm.
the rest of the crew didn't know about, and we as the audience didn't know about. I can't imagine in 1979 the reveal of him being an android, experiencing that for the first time. It must have been absolutely wild, because as well, the scene where it's revealed that he's an android, there's 2 parts to the reveal.
Mm-hmm.
There's the first part, which is one of my favorite just moments in a movie ever, is when the captain of the ship is speaking with the AI of the ship, which is named Mother.
Which is a great name for a sinister ship.
Yeah. And so when Dallas is speaking to the ship and learning about the true nature of their expedition, he leans back and Ash is right there sitting beside him.
Oh, yeah. It's like a full Batman moment.
Yeah.
The shadows just spat him out.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite small moments of this entire movie. And that's where the reveal is that he really is operating separate from everything else.
Yeah. And there's that other great moment where Ripley, and she's furious.
Yeah.
When she finds out like mother's orders and all that. She's like, "What does this mean, Ash?" And he's like, "Oh, I thought it was quite clear." Like,
Yeah.
right. And then there's that moment when like he just hurls her bodily against the wall with one arm.
Yeah.
And like he's not a big guy.
No.
So that's another terrifying moment. And then that other guy comes in and bonks his head clean off.
The decapitation is like one of the most visceral and surprising moments of the entire movie. Like, and it's also the effects of it are incredibly well done.
Oh, I fully admit, I think the scene with Ash getting his head bonked off and like his arms are flailing and all that.
Yeah.
I think that's actually more terrifying than the xenomorph.
Yeah.
There's just something so wrong about it.
Yeah, like literally the top half of his head comes off and like a little bit of like his neck and like a little bit of his kind of shoulder space kind of comes off with it. And it's just like it's so unexpected and also just like again, shot so well, it looks so real. Like I'm sitting there like thinking like how did they do that in 1979, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
So well done. And then
there's also that terrifying moment where he's got Ripley in his clutches and it's like he rolls up a magazine and like stuffs it in her mouth.
Yeah.
And there's just something so bizarre but like violent about that moment.
Yeah, and he's like single-handedly like keeping her down with that and holding everybody off. And then after they knock his head off, we get the big reveal that obviously he's not human, and they actually like recalibrate and turn him back on and then have the discussion with his head, right?
Right, and that's where there's that great line. I just said it. It's like someone says like you admire it and he just goes, "I admire its purity."
Right.
And then as they're about to leave, he just goes, "Oh, one more thing, like I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies."
Yeah.
And then they burn him.
Honestly, the character of Ash, so the idea of androids in the Alien film series actually becomes like one of the main ideas of these film series. Like it becomes like something that's prominent throughout the rest of the franchise, and some of the movies from this franchise are like honestly some of the best parts. Like the movie Prometheus, which is a prequel, which we'll talk about, with Michael Fassbender as the android in that movie.
David, yeah.
Maybe spoilers there. I can't even remember if I think it's known right from the get-go that he's an android in that movie.
I think it's known right from the get-go.
Just the exploration of what it means to be a human being, and also like the fact that, you know, we're creating almost like alien life forms, like these humans that are reflections of ourselves, but made by a corporation.
Yeah. I mean, with the rise of AI in the last couple of years, that is certainly
and
doesn't
like
sit so well.
Yeah, and like, you know, who controls the machine, and like all of these kind of questions that this movie brings up and like this movie series brings up. I think that like this has become like one of the most iconic ideas out of this film, right?
Yeah, and this whole idea gets followed up on in a very interesting way in the sequel. And again, it's funny. I did a little bit of research and I found out that Dan O'Bannon, or whatever his name was,
the writer, Dan O'Bannon,
Santa, he actually objected to this inclusion and he didn't think it was necessary. And this is one of those moments where I have to actually side with the studio heads and be like, no, I think it makes this movie that much better.
Yeah, it just adds like this element of intrigue throughout the film of like this character, especially like on further watches as you start to notice how this character is responding to everybody else around him and how he's different from everybody else. The more you see this movie and the more you catch those little differences, those little the shifty eyes and the like ulterior motives and stuff like that, like it really adds to the rewatchability of this movie in one hand. It also just like creates this timeless theme that just becomes like more and more relevant as time goes on. And I, like we already mentioned, again, just circling back, like the fact that he is an android that is controlled and is given directives directly from a corporation, which are confidential and not privy to the rest of the crew. The rest of the crew doesn't even know he's an android. Like all of this is just so sinister, but so relevant.
Right. And even just like from a pure storytelling perspective, like it's a great source of tension, right? I got a piece of writing advice a couple of years ago where I forget who it was, but they said, if you're halfway through your story and it feels like it's starting to drag, The problem is usually that your main characters are getting along too much. So like having a traitor or a backstabber in the midst just is a great source of like twisting the knife in the viewer's heart, I guess.
Yeah, and like that's the other thing as well that this movie does, and to this movie's favor, is that the characters don't have a backstory. The characters don't have, like, we don't click clips of these characters having a video call with their families or anything like that, right?
No.
So we don't know anything about any of these people. We have no idea what their motives are. So really, when the two mechanics are complaining and like bouncing off what everybody else is thinking, they're the characters that you look at as like the primary antagonists for the first act of the movie, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And it's great how we just kind of get shoved into this situation with all these characters and they immediately just start like it's not immediately clear who to latch onto.
Yeah. And that's also like one of the more successful parts of the movie, is that I think that's a great way to put it, is like we don't know who to latch onto. Like we know this is a horror movie. We don't know who's going to survive because we don't even know who like we're supposed to be representing or who's supposed to be representing the audience, really, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things where like we can look at it now and we're instantly like, oh, Sigourney Weaver's the main character. And I mean, obviously we're doing this for Sigourney Weaver month,
Yeah.
but like there's that great moment early on where she's arguing with the two maintenance guys and she can't be heard over all the steam coming out of the pipes.
Mm-hmm.
And then she leaves and they immediately just turn a wheel and all the steam stops.
Right.
So it's like, if you side with Sigourney Weaver, these guys are dicks. But if you're siding with them, you're like, ha, like that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
You showed her.
Well, and yeah, that's exactly it, right? Like they're the bluest collar of the bluest collar workers on this ship as well, right? Like you almost feel like you should side with them because they're the ones getting the short end of the stick often in this movie.
Yeah, and I guess that's another thing we should talk about, is that this is very much a 70s movie.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that Aliens is very much an 80s movie, this movie is just dripping with that like 70s pessimism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great point as well because, we talked about the corporation's relationship to Ash, but, the corporation is something that gets brought up quite a bit throughout the movie, and it's a relevant plot detail, is that they're all employees of this. Like, they're not a bunch of space explorers. They're just a bunch of people who are out doing their jobs, and they're just a bunch of regular people who have been asked to go and investigate this weird phenomena that has happened.
Yeah. And again, there's that great moment where they're all like, we don't really want to, but then Ash is like, oh, well, if you don't, you're forfeiting your company shares. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is also just kind of like a really interesting concept in and of itself, that like, and I almost believe that something like this would probably happen in real life several hundred years down the line, if we're actually at a point where we're traveling through space and mining resources, etc. There would be probably some provision to go and check out distressed ships because of the remoteness of space. Like if you just happen to be in that area.
Yeah, I think there's like a similar code of conduct with like naval ships, right?
Yeah,
Where it's
exactly.
like if you're close by, you go help.
But there's also that like human curiosity, right? Like that human, what is over there that I don't know about? And this distress signal just kind of like piques that interest of like more existential, like, well, maybe it could be aliens, so therefore we should check it out just to see what it is.
Yeah.
And that's
really.
actually, we talked about Ash, but I actually want to circle back to the first act of the movie, which is really the sci-fi part of the movie, the exploration part, like the pioneers of space, kind of, as you might. Like the first part of this movie is all about just being out in space and getting this weird distress signal. And like this is the slowest part of the movie, but it's just like, it's so, the entire part of this movie, like you're just kind of hanging on to like, what are they going to find next? Like, where are we going? Like, what is going to happen? Like, it's so caked in mystery, but it's also just like so interesting getting to explore like this new world. And we get to this world, and you mentioned this before, that this world that they've built where the alien ship has crash landed on is just so derelict, right? Like it's so remote, like
Yeah.
it's inhospitable. It just looks wrong and miserable.
Yeah, and like they find an alien and it's long dead.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh,
Which,
okay.
which is maybe like the start of one of the best parts of this movie is the art direction of this. I'll mention this in more detail later, but I believe it's H.R. Geiger is the artist who kind of inspired a lot of this.
Yep,
And
that's the guy.
yeah, and so this is a movie that cared a lot about how it depicted the alien and how it depicted everything kind of around this alien. Like this is where the main focus of the movie is inside the interiors of this spaceship and this massive alien that they find. Like this is one of the coolest parts of the movie is when they enter the cockpit, right? And this dead alien is in some sort of like it's almost like looks like this massive like Gatling gun or something like that.
Yeah.
And we have no context for what's happened here. And the movie doesn't really explore that because how would you explore that? That this is such a different life form from anything that we've experienced. And the interior of the ship is just like it's like hell, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it almost looks like the ship we've entered like the cavity of like this great beast, right? And we're just looking at the insides of it. Like as they traverse through things, it's just like weird, almost like bone-like structure throughout the interior of the ship.
It doesn't look like a human has ever set foot there.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. Like it's almost very like eldritch to use like a Lovecraftian term, right?
Yeah.
It just looks wrong and bizarre.
Right. And so like as we delve deeper into this segment of the movie, like just even the visuals are just throwing you off. Like there's just something so wrong about everything that we're walking into here, and that these characters are just almost like mundanely going through just to like check off the boxes on their corporate directive, right?
At the same time, it's like if you found something that's strange, like I think you'd either have two instincts. You'd either want to run away or you'd be like, what the fuck is that? And
Yeah.
you'd wander in deeper into it.
Yeah, which is
I'm personally in the runaway camp, but I'm not that curious.
well, and the one character, right, heads down further into the ship, right? And that's where we end up in the ag part of the ship.
Yeah, and that's when he gets face hugged. Yeah.
Kane, the executive officer, right? This is a really cool part of the movie because it's again like one of the highlights of the effects of the film, like using that really interesting laser beam. He's like, oh, there's like some sort of laser like over these eggs.
It's like a mist kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like a force field that he accidentally trips through, and then when he touches an egg, it kind of like starts to come alive again after God knows how long the ship has been stranded here, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Another, not to cut you off, but another great detail is that we never learn where this ship was going or why.
Yeah.
It's a complete mystery to us.
Yeah, and
we never find out.
Yeah, that's what I was saying before, right? Is like we just don't know anything. Like and how would we ever figure out any of this, right? Like the ship to even like grasp a basic like understanding of how the ship would even operate would take years and like probably dozens if not hundreds of people constantly spending time reviewing this. And like it looks like at this point in time we've definitely gone out into space and we're interstellar at this point, but or intergalactic maybe, but somebody at some point will go and study this. But this is like a first contact. Like at this point in time there's never been any sort of alien contact by the sounds of it.
Yeah, this is a first time extraterrestrial. By the way, as far as first contact situations go, this one could have gone a lot better. I did see a quote from Ridley Scott where he said that basically he wanted to make like a slasher movie in space. So like this alien ship was like his idea of like a haunted house.
Right.
Like a spooky haunted house.
Well, and that's kind of when we get into like the legacy of this movie. I think at first like a lot of people just looked at this movie as a haunted house movie, and that's the extent of it. Like if you came at this in 1979 before, you watch it one time and nobody has talked about this movie at all, you might come away like a little bit like, oh, like I've kind of seen this story before. but it's more the sum of its parts really here.
Yeah.
Because,
No, you haven't.
they spend so much time developing the aesthetic of the alien ship and even like the human ship and everything going on, that it's all of these tiny details that really make this movie pop.
Yeah, absolutely. It all comes together and coalesces perfectly.
Yeah. I love the first act of the movie, despite it being slow, because like there's this kind of adventurousness that I really enjoy in a movie, like this like what are we gonna stumble upon kind of thing. That first act really, really explores this idea of like finding something that we've never seen before.
I feel like between the two of us, I'm often the more impatient.
Yeah.
I know my previous partner used to complain that I would complain that everything was too long and that everything could have been cut down.
Right.
But I really appreciate the first act and how we just go step by step with these characters.
Yeah.
We discover, to quote myself, a bunch of no goodness.
No good badness. No, and I think that, if they hadn't have spent as much time, if they hadn't have found an artist to really have them inspire like what came out of this like alien design and everything, I think that if we didn't have this level of detail and this like perverse of a artistic like perspective, that we almost probably would have gotten bored in the first act of the movie.
I talked earlier about how it's a single scene that sells that movie. I'm going to renege on that right away. It's almost really the design, you know? Because, like, I don't think this movie or this franchise would have popped without the weird madness of H.R. Giger. I was reading about the guy. Apparently, a lot of the inspiration for his work came from the horrible, frequent nightmares the poor man had.
Jesus.
Yeah.
That's terrifying.
I know. This man was like tapped into like another realm of reality.
Yeah, like
Poor
it's
guy.
Lovecraftian style almost, right?
Yeah.
But it's even like darker than that, I would almost say.
Yeah.
And then the second act of the movie is really when they get back on the ship and they're trying to figure out, what they've unleashed upon themselves. And the characters are kind of just trying to like, really decide on how they're going to respond to this, like, and how all of these different characters react to the idea of this alien life form that has essentially compromised one of their crewmates.
So I guess we can talk about it. It's the spoiler section.
Yep.
So the facehugger lays an egg in its belly, and then during dinner it bursts out.
Which is like also just a horribly primal fear of just like this alien latching onto your face, and then when they're trying to cut it off, like every time they touch it, it just like wraps itself tighter around
the neck. Yeah.
Which is really disturbing. And the alien itself, like the facehugger, the arm like finger like things on there are so well done. Like the effects of everything that they made around this alien, they spent so much detail and time creating this that like they actually do look like real. I think you would call them mandibles almost.
Yeah, mandibles for sure.
It's so crazy seeing this and seeing it done so realistic with the horror element involved in that. It just makes it that much more terrifying that our first contact is so deeply terrifying, right?
Yeah, there's that great scene where they got him sprawled out on the medical bay and they're just looking at it and they have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
And you can just see like, John Hurt is still breathing underneath that.
Right. Yeah.
And there's that line where like, well, he's in a coma.
Yeah.
And it's like, Jesus. And then there's that other great detail of like, they try to cut it off, but it bleeds acid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it almost like bleeds through the hull of their entire ship before it finally tapers off.
That's another great detail. And it almost makes sense, right? Like creatures on Earth have evolved with all these weird defense mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine bleeding acid.
Yeah.
My blood is corrosive, so you can't fight me.
Everything about this alien is bred to complete its mission, essentially.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's something that Ash really comes to respect about this creation. And being a creation himself, like that's somewhat very interesting, right? As the reflection of him and this alien.
And then the horror of that scene gets followed up on when they decide to go looking for it. And it turns out these things grow pretty rapidly.
Yeah.
Like a lot rapidly.
Yeah.
So,
well, and even like before we get into that as well, like I did want to mention, like if you feel really uncomfortable watching this movie, and like if the perverseness of like the alien, like, because we might as well say it now, the alien's head looks like a giant penis, basically.
giant dong, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, even like the whole idea of the face hugger laying a egg in your belly, like there's almost like implications of sexual assault floating around that movie.
Well, and that's the theme that this movie really leans into, is like male rape, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. Like even I didn't really get this until I read a little more about it, but I mean it's pretty obvious in hindsight. Even Ash rolling up the porno magazine and shoving it into Ripley's mouth, like there's something very aggressive about that.
Yeah.
You know?
That's something that is really prevalent in this movie that they thought of. And even, back in the 70s, revenge films, like rape and revenge films, were kind of a big part of exploitation films of the 70s. And so this coming at the end of the tail end of the 70s, it was actually kind of a response to all of those movies that took place in the 70s. And they kind of did like an Uno reverse on it, right? Instead of making it this female who had been raped, and then either she is on a revenge plot to have revenge against the people who did that to her, or it's a male actor who's avenging somebody in his family or friends or whatever. It's the males who are being raped by aliens in this movie. And as this movie goes on, it's actually Ripley who is the protagonist of the film.
Yeah. We actually covered this movie in film school like 12 years ago. And I remember my professor breaking down the whole themes of the movie and like showing us like an image of like the heroes wandering into the alien ship. And like if you look at the entrance to the ship, it looks like a womb. And
vagina.
Vagina. Yeah. And they go in and they find the eggs, and then there's even that moment where the alien is confronting, is it Lambert? Like the only other woman on board?
Right.
Just as he's about to kill her, you see its tail kind of rise between its legs, and it's like, oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
No.
There's a lot of sexual innuendo in the most disturbing way possible, which is, again, how this movie gets under your fingernails, right?
Yep. This movie will make you asexual.
Yeah. So just before the chest burster scene, there's the scene where, the acid blood happens, and the whole crew who is trying to repair their shuttle that's landed on this ship decides, you know what? We're good enough. We're getting out of here.
Yeah. Fuck this.
There's like some heavy heebie-jeebies that are going on all over the ship.
Honestly, fair response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like this is kind of where things really have started to take a turn, and everybody's like kind of on edge at this point.
There's a lot of great scenes of people yelling at each other.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, honestly, I work in a restaurant. I've seen people yell at each other for a lot less.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, and you kind of just understand, like, these characters never come across as, like, dumb or making bad decisions necessarily, or even, like, on the flip side, it never really feels like they're over intelligent, like they have like a perfect answer for everything.
I do want to contest that. So I mentioned in our previous episode that there are some, like, let's say dated tropes in this movie. There's that moment where one of the maintenance guys, Parker, I think his name is, he scares off the cat, and they're like, well, Parker, like, you need to go get the cat because it's going to set off our motion sensors.
Right.
So it's an incredibly tense and incredibly well done scene of Parker wandering around alone looking for the cat.
Yeah, and he's in like all the maintenance stuff, and like that water is weirdly dripping down inside the ship. I'd like an explanation for that. I didn't find one online, but
I was like, is this the shower?
Yeah.
Like, and then there's that great moment where he finds Jones the cat, and like turns out the cat is the best actor in the movie. The cat is like hiding, and it's like, I'm not going out there.
Yeah.
Like, that's when we first meet the fully formed alien, and it's a great scene, but to me, I was just watching it like, do you not know you're in a horror movie? Don't go off alone. Like,
yeah. Well, at this point, they haven't met, or nobody's interacted with a full alien yet. They think it's just a little life form at this point.
You know what?
Right?
That's a fair point, and I didn't consider that.
Yeah.
They think it's just a little asshole running around. But
right.
yeah, no, that's totally fair. But then there's that other moment where the captain decides, I'm just going to go into the air vents alone with a flamethrower and try to flush it out.
Well, they had a plan. Somebody had to go into there because that's where the alien was. They had to flesh it out so that they could trap it in the, what was it, like the doors,
the
so
thing,
they could
yeah.
launch it out into space.
As much as, okay, I'm being a bit of a dick in complaining about these moments, but they are incredibly well done and incredibly tense scenes.
I think if you're going to complain about any scene being somewhat silly, like the biggest stretch of the entire movie is Parker being asked to go alone to go get the cat.
Yes, for sure.
That's definitely to me, the only stretch of the movie. I think first time view, you're going to be ticked off when Ash opens the doors and overrides Ripley's commands that they stay out because of quarantine.
I don't even know that you'd be ticked off by that because, like, if you don't know, you might see Ash as, like, just looking out for his friends. But...
Right. But that's the thing is, like, Ash's facial expressions never look like he's actually concerned about anyone.
There's also that, yeah.
So, and parts of that is just having watched this movie as many times as you or I have, like, you know that about the character already. So, like, I'm visually looking for Ash's responses and seeing how he's actually, like, taking in everything going on around him.
You know what? I would really like to, Blake actually made me a whiskey ginger before we started recording. I would like you to make me 18 more. So much so that I get a weird, like, I go into a fugue state where I don't remember this movie, then show it to me for the first time. We'll see how that goes.
It's maybe one of the best spoiler-free watches of a movie you could ever watch.
Yeah, I almost, like, I wish my dad was still alive because I would have loved to have just put this on and be like, hey, Dad, here you go. Like,
yeah.
You know.
Part of it is just because of, like, how well done all of these special effects are that make it look so real.
Yeah. But again, I mean, the iconography of this series has, like, influenced everything. Like, there's even that Rick and Morty episode from a few years ago where they're like, oh, like, fuck off, Summer. Sometimes you just want to look at a moist egg on a ship.
Yeah, like, this is pretty much the 2001 Space Odyssey movie of the 70s. Like, this is on par with probably how much it influenced movies of this era. Like,
pretty
it's up
much,
there with
yeah.
Star Wars, like... It's up there with Blade Runner. Like, these are all, like, it's in the running for one of the most influential sci-fis of all time.
Yeah. And I mean, can we talk about the third act when they decide to just blow? So they realize that Ash is a traitor. They burn him alive. It's just Ripley and the two others left. And they decide they're just going to hop on this. They're just going to blow the fuck out of the ship and, like, race away on the shuttle.
Yeah.
So it's Parker and Lambert and Ripley, and, like, Ripley has to go start the self-destruct sequence, and then Lambert and Parker are, like, loading fuel canisters or something onto the shuttle. Then the fucking alien shows up and just bodies both of them. I will say Parker, you know, he spent most of the movie yelling and, like, being difficult. He goes down like a hero. Like, he goes down trying to protect his friend.
Yep.
And it doesn't work, but
and then the part of, like, the horror of that as well is their walkie-talkie is on the entire time they're being murdered,
disemboweled,
by the alien.
yeah.
And so Ripley gets to listen to her friends or her coworkers be pretty viciously murdered.
Right. And then there's those great scenes of Ripley, like, making her way through the ship with, like, just a flamethrower on one hand, and she's all hunched over, and, like, at this point in the series, she's not a badass.
No.
She's just a blue-collar woman doing her job, and she's in a ship that's exploding around her facing, like, the worst killing machine of all time.
Yeah. This is also, like, I think one of the best, like, third acts of a movie. Just, like, her wandering around the ship. Everybody is slowly being murdered around her. And this is where she really starts to pop as the primary actor.
As the protagonist, yeah.
This is really where the best part of the horror sinks in is the not knowing, because we don't see this alien for large stretches of the movie, and we never know when it's going to pop out.
It's not like a typical shitty teen slasher movie where, like, the villain is on screen at all times and you're almost, like, rooting for the villain so you can kill all these stock characters. Like, when the alien shows up, terrible things happen.
It's like the Jaws mantra, right? The less is more. Like, build the tension and then get your big release moment.
Yeah. And speaking of a big release moment, Ripley manages to get on the shuttle and escape before the ship blows up.
Yeah.
And then
Which
the movie just keeps going.
that is maybe one of having seen this is probably my 4th time watching this movie, and it's been at least 5 years since I watched this movie last. Probably longer than that, probably closer to 8. And so I had forgotten about the quote-unquote 4th act of the movie.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that was something that I wasn't expecting because, I know the trajectory of where the second movie is going. You think that finally Ripley and the cat have gotten away, that they've gotten in the shuttle and it's over, the alien's gone. Who knows where it's gone, but the ship has blown up.
It got blowed up, yeah.
Suddenly, out of basically it's in the frame, the hand just kind of slowly drops down in front of her.
It uncoils, yeah.
Yeah. And it's both one of the biggest shocks of the movie is that we aren't actually safe yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's also maybe one of the weakest parts of the alien appearing in the film, in the sense that the alien's just kind of
taking a nap.
Yeah, almost.
I'm like, bro, wake up. Yeah.
It really it almost doesn't even care that she's there with it. For one of nature's most creative killing machines in movie history, it just kind of hanging out.
It really does seem like it's just woken up from a nap.
Yeah.
Right? And I guess you can make the argument that it's fed quite a bit, so it's in a food coma.
Yeah, but that's maybe a good point actually as well.
I will say, so I remembered that the alien is still on the vessel.
Yep.
I watched this movie with my mom, who I think saw it when it came out in theaters in 1979. It's interesting because Ripley is on the shuttle and she starts kind of disrobing and getting into her undergarments. And my mom just kept going something bad's going to happen, something bad's going to happen, something bad's going to happen. And it's they drag out those moments of safety so much that it almost makes the tension unbearable. Right?
Yeah.
Because it's funny, I remembered, but I was watching it okay, any minute now. And it went on for I almost want to say 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Just Ripley just hanging out. I had a moment where I almost started gaslighting myself where I'm wait, no, the alien's got to show up, right?
Yeah.
Then it does. I'm ah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's that's such a cool trick though to play on the viewer where it's almost things start going a little too well for your heroes and your stomach starts twisting where you're something terrible is going to happen.
Yeah.
I remember watching The Last of Us last year, and there's that 10-15 minutes where Joel and Ellie are just kind of on their way having a good time, and I was just something heartbreaking is about to happen.
Right.
And that's when you have your viewer by the balls, when they do not trust you anymore.
Yeah. I kind of rip on the alien a little bit here, but you're right. This 4th act is maybe one of the most tense parts of the whole movie because you have the sigh of relief, but then it just goes on a little too long, if this was truly the end of the movie, she would have just put the cat to sleep and then gone into the cryo chamber, and that would have been the end of it.
I saw this meme recently where this person was talking about how her daughter was reading Jane Eyre for the first time, and the daughter was well, they're about to get married, but there's 200 pages left, so it's not looking good.
Yeah. Well, and actually, this is kind of affecting filming a little bit, but the original ending of this movie was actually just the ship exploding and Ripley escaping on the shuttle. That's where the movie actually normally would have ended in a typical script. And then Ridley Scott came up with the idea of Act 4. What he actually wanted, though, was the alien to bite her head off, and that's how the movie was going to end.
Fucking head off, yeah. I didn't realize this, but apparently most horror movies back in the day were huge downers.
Yeah.
Nobody lived.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that ending, would have hurt the rest of the franchise since Ripley becomes the main protagonist of the next 4 or next 3 films. But B, again, it's the bitterness that doesn't always land in a movie. And I think in this case, to have this long tension building moment, having this horrible thing happen, and then having her die at the end would have felt
fuck off.
Yeah. Really too insulting almost.
I'm going to say something a little controversial. I'm not a miserable guy, but I love misery.
Yeah.
I love downer endings. The Road is one of my favorite movies.
Yes.
I love feeling I love feeling despair.
But
Wait, let me finish.
okay,
But I will say, I don't think that would have been the right ending.
No.
Like, I think Ridley. I think Ridley deserved to live.
Ripley. You said Ridley Scott.
I think Ripley Scott deserved to live. You can leave that in. I don't care.
I will, and then he's gonna die randomly, and you're gonna feel bad.
I'm gonna
about
feel
it.
really
People
bad.
are gonna hate us.
Ooh.
But no, I think that again, I think you're right. Like I think that it just would have the payoff versus the everything leading up to that. It just would have been too jarring of an ending.
Yeah. Right.
So I think that in this case, like if you're building towards a depressing ending, you kind of have to like be building towards that the whole time. And this one wasn't really doing that.
Well, and it's almost like the classic definition of tragedy is a character who fails to learn from their flaws or who fails to adapt and then dies.
Right.
Ridley constantly adapts to the situation.
Yes.
Like she's clever, she's resourceful, she's strong. She deserved to live.
Yes. And that would have been a massive disservice. Like
Like-
it would have been a betrayal
Yeah,
to
right?
the character.
Yeah.
We never talked about the chest burster scene. We talked around it. We talked about it in the primer episode, but we never actually talked about the chest burster scene.
I guess we didn't, did we?
No.
No.
So the chest burster scene, again, this is effects and filming a little bit, but this is also, as a side note, like one of the most detailed films that I've ever read about. Like the history of the making of this movie is one of just the most well-documented films ever made, I think.
It's pretty cool. It's really fun. We were just talking before we started recording about how like this is the most detailed Wikipedia page we've ever seen.
Yeah. I think that, it's hard not to talk about effects and filming because as you research this movie, a lot of that stuff becomes apparent. And the chest burster scene is no different from that because not only is it like one of the most iconic scenes in the movie, it's also like the scene that I think probably they spent maybe some of the most time in getting right and doing well.
Yeah.
They knew that this was going to be the big moment, the big like shock value of the movie. And they did it in a way that I think was really interesting in that they didn't really tell the actors what was going to happen in explicit detail.
Oh yeah.
So really the only ones who knew were Kane, who has the chest burster come out of him. And it sounded like Dallas's actor had a little bit of an idea of what was about to happen, but the actors knew that the alien was going to burst out, and they knew that something was going to happen. There's actually 2 takes of this, and the 2 takes actually got intertwined and spliced into one. So in the first take, the alien kind of bursts out, but it doesn't burst through the chest all the way or the shirt all the way. And then there's supposed to be, like a little bit of blood. The alien pops out and scares everybody. But what the actors didn't know was just how visceral this was all going to be, how much blood was going to spew out, and just like, I guess the alien's mannerisms as it came out, right? And like what it was going to look like. And so just the pure shock of that was actually captured for like in the first scene, the shot of that scene when they made it. Like all of those reactions are the real reactions of the actors essentially.
Listen,
right?
I do not condone abusive behavior, but I love stories about directors like playing basically cruel pranks on their actors.
Yeah, like Veronica Cartwright was like put into a state of shock by this scene essentially. The woman playing Lambert, like she was the one who got the full brunt of the blood when it exploded out of there. Like she basically like went into shock on the ground. And so like her screaming, like her being like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, like it's her actually like freaking out on set.
Yeah.
So
fantastic.
Yes, it is like one of the most iconic scenes for a reason, and part of it is just because of like the sheer authenticity of the reactions.
Yeah, and I mean, holy shit, it's incredible.
It's also just like, again, it's perverse in that it's like a male birth scene, which is disturbing. Like it plays on the fears, and this is part of like, getting into the deep analysis of this movie. It's playing on some of the fears of the male experience in that, we don't experience stuff like birth in the way that females do, and so having to experience it through these characters is and in this horrifying way, it just makes it like all that scarier, right?
And again, I kind of alluded to this in our spoiler-free episode. It's just the sheer wrongness, like the sheer sense of violation, you know? Imagine having like a parasitic monster growing inside you.
Yeah.
And then popping right out.
Yeah. In like the most aggressive possible way.
Yeah, it's not like passing a kidney stone. It's
No.
bursting out of your gullet.
Well, and like the other part of the scene is like he's gotten up and he's like, "Oh, I'm okay, guys," and it feels like
yeah.
there's like
that
this.
too.
There's also like this moment of like everything's kind of okay, and there's no real hint that something is still wrong with him per
And
se.
you know what? I will give the movie credit. Despite knowing what's going to happen, that like palpable sense of relief is very palpable, you
Yeah,
know? Like
yeah.
it's almost like, and we've all been there, like in the workplace, you think something terrible is going to happen. Somehow you escape and you're just like, oh, never mind. I guess everything's cool. Oh, let's all hang out. And then they're
Yeah.
all just eating around the table, cracking jokes.
Yeah, and everybody's like just enjoying themselves before they go back into cryo sleep. And you can see, and this is part of the other, like, again, the fantastic part of Ian Holm's performance and the way that, you know, this film is crafted. Ian Holm as the medical officer, while everybody else is laughing and having a good time and just like, you know, shedding some of the terror that they've had up until this moment, he's just kind of like viewing everybody and watching and waiting to see what's going to happen. You know, it's maybe alluded to earlier that he sees some sort of alien creature growing inside of Kane. Like, there's this brief moment where he's caught by Ripley doing some research, and he shuts off the cameras and the pictures that he has of the alien. He's like, I don't know what's going on. But doesn't elaborate at all, right?
Yeah,
like,
I don't know.
It's very sinister, and then Kane, as he's eating and laughing and having a good time, it starts to look like he's choking almost.
Yeah.
Which is like what you were saying before, right? About how everybody has experienced something similar to that at some point or another in their lives, whether
We
it's
certainly
real
have.
serious or not. Yeah.
Yeah. Can we tell that story on podcast?
I don't think we need to.
Okay. It's not much. It's okay. Blake, I, and another friend were having dinner at a restaurant a few months ago. Some lady started choking. Me and the other guy just kind of looked at each other like, I don't know, should we do something? And then Blake put on like his superhero cape and gave this poor woman the Heimlich.
It was something. It was an experience.
Yeah,
that
I
now have
remember
had.
just watching you do that and just thinking to myself, wow, like I really need to learn some skills so I'll be more useful in a real life or death situation.
Yeah, and I guess like that probably plays into some of my experience of this scene as well, right? Like it doesn't make this scene any less scary having experienced it. It actually probably makes it, in fact, more scary.
Yeah, right?
Because you understand a little bit more of the reactions and like that process. Because I can tell you, like, from experience, that dinner scene, if you just replaced it with Kane choking, that's largely just kind of how it goes.
Pretty much,
And
yeah.
so again, it's something that this movie does really well, is that it makes all of the characters feel, even though we don't know these characters all that well, it makes all these characters feel real, and their predicaments feel like earnest, like what their concerns are and how they're approaching these situations.
Like, hey, that fucker's choking. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say, the sequence with the captain going into the vents might be my favorite. Even though I was a little like, come on, man. But then I was like, all right, fuck it. Like,
Right.
somebody's got to flush that thing out. That's a great sequence where, like, they realize that, like, Lambert's like, oh my God, we're picking up another signal on the motion tracker. And he's like, no, like, it's right on top of you. He's like, I don't see it. And then he starts, he basically just like, all right, fuck this, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Starts going down the vent. And then there's that moment where the alien just reaches out and grabs him.
Yeah.
And there's no big sting. It just happens so quickly.
Right.
My old professor used to call it like the big hug scene.
If we had to pick like favorite death scenes, I think mine is probably Brett's death, and like you said, like, yeah, it's really cliche and everything, but it's also just like, in my opinion, one of the more like cinematic moments of the movie. Like, he's in like that really large mining,
like the garage
warehouse.
or
Yeah,
something.
the garage, and like the water's kind of raining down on him, and just the visuals of that scene are just so cool. Like, and the chains. So that's the other part. I was saving this a little bit for score, but I'll talk about it now slightly, is I love the use of sound in this movie.
That's a great point.
The use of natural sound in this movie. Like, the chains just kind of slowly jangling in the warehouse as Brett's kind of searching for the cat in there. And, like, the way that as the tension rises, the movie is really largely quiet. Like, it doesn't lean on the score to build tension. What it then takes the score is then to almost maintain the tension as the big alien moments like happen.
Yeah, it's very, again, me being, I love when Jason and I did Rules of the Game and we looked at each other like, did you notice the score? No, neither did I. Okay, moving on. But yeah, no, this is a very effective use of sound.
Yeah.
Which is to say, very little sound.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like one of those old, like, I think we've talked about this on a previous episode where, like, you can either have a score that becomes, like, part of the main DNA of the movie. Like, it becomes, when I think of the movie Trainspotting, I think of the score of that movie. Whereas a movie like this, I don't necessarily think about the score immediately, and that's why, we're however far into this episode and I'm just thinking about it now. But it's something that I think it's in the background and it's not the forefront of your head, but what it does is it effectively makes everything else about this movie pop.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that we haven't really talked about in too much detail yet is just like the set design of the spaceship, because, we've talked about the alien spaceship, but I think that this is one of the most detailed sets I've ever seen. And it feels like even now, you can laugh and joke about some of the computer technology and go, oh, like that looks really dated or whatever. But even as like old retro like maintenance equipment, like, it's serviceable, but just the interiors of the ship like feel, it's so corporate, like it's so practical.
It looks like a trash can floating through space.
Yeah.
Like it really is just like, it's almost like the Millennium Falcon if it were like a corporate truck kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually something that I was reading about online, is that like just how effective that is and how different that is for the time. Like up until this point in time, like any sci-fi movie comes across as really clean and really like high tech, and like everything looks, just so pristine and clean. But this, it's like dark and grimy and just so baseline usable, and that's it.
Yeah, it's kind of like there was that infamous live action adaptation of Cowboy Bebop a couple of years ago where, they tried to make that ship, I forget what it was called, look like, a shitty little freighter. And I remember like watching this movie thinking, if they ever do decide to retry a Cowboy Bebop adaptation, the ship would probably kind of work.
Yeah.
Or like something similar to this, right?
Yeah.
Where it's old and it's shitty and it's barely held together, but like it's serviceable.
Yeah. Because that's that at the end of the day, like, again, this goes into like the capitalist ideas of the movie and like the capitalist ideas of the 70s and kind of the rallying against capitalism a little bit, that like the ship is just barely running, just enough to function, and we don't really care about the comfort of the crew on board. Like that doesn't really matter. Making money matters.
It's kind of like, I actually bought a new car back in February, and prior to that I was driving around this old ass Ford Focus, and it was kind of just like every now and then the engine would stutter, and I'd just be like, come on, old girl. I gotta get to Blake's to record.
Yeah, and that also like just adds to some of the realism too of like the fear in the ship, because we see the shuttle break down and like them just scraping by to get it working again, and B, like as this alien's moving through the ship, you're like, there is that fear of like what's going to happen. And then even in the third act, like when I mean, this is another maybe minor like detail of just like the fact that the ship has like a self-destruct protocol.
Yeah.
Which it seems almost like silly that a ship would have that on board. Like, why would you need that?
Do you not have? I have a big red button in my apartment that if I press it for more than 3 seconds, it detonates the whole building.
Yeah. I guess
do you
I
not
haven't
have
get that installed. No.
Oh, you should.
But
I don't know why you would, but you should.
Even in that moment, right, where she's like trying to then shut it down and like stop it from happening, and it's just like so ridiculously like,
it's so obtuse.
Yeah. That like it just becomes really complicated, and like and then she's not successfully able to even stop it. Like that's such a like anti-capitalist idea of like, this dumb thing that they've added in there for who knows what reason, and it doesn't actually work all that well.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's like you said, there's that great moment where she decides, oh, I need to actually delay the self-destruct sequence, but it's
Yeah.
like, nah, too bad, we're blowing up.
It's like on the Titanic when they realize that they don't actually have enough boats on the ship, and that was just a business decision.
Yeah,
of like,
right.
why would we put all of those on there? Because it's never going to sink.
Yeah, no kidding, right? I remember I'm having a war flashback. I remember going to see Monsters vs. Aliens in theaters in what was my first ever date. And there's that bit where like the president wants to make himself a cup of coffee, so he goes to touch the big red button. Like, no, that's the self-destruct button. And he looks to the right, and there's an identical big red button that dispenses coffee.
Nice.
And he's like, who designed this? And they're like, you did, sir.
All right, let's talk effects and filming, because that's a fun point of discussion. And this is where I want to bring up Dan O'Bannon, the writer of this movie.
Santa.
Yeah. So I actually watched Dark Star for the first time this year, which is John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon's student film, which became a feature film as they were making it.
Okay, right, yeah.
One of like the coolest small scale. I haven't seen a ton of student films because I didn't go to film school.
Oh, you're not missing much, Blake.
Yeah. It's just like a really cool achievement in filmmaking that they were able to make it, and it kind of is the first iteration of Truckers in Space, essentially. Like it's a comedy truckers in space kind of movie where the ship is barely functional. These three workers who I believe they go around like blowing up planets, bad planets and stuff like that.
That's pretty funny.
And they're all kind of just like hate their lives and hate their job. I think Dan O'Bannon wanted to take that idea and like expand on it and expand on maybe make it a little bit scarier than what he originally envisioned with John Carpenter with that movie.
Nice.
When he originally wrote this, the actual original script was quite a bit different from what we got. Like there was at least 3 significant rewrites by other writers and the studio, like you mentioned before. Like, there's a lot that changed over time in this one.
Mm-hmm. Well, including the whole Ash subplot, which Santa put on his naughty list.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I think that, the planning of this movie is really interesting as well because they sought out artwork and some sort of like thematic ideas, and that's where they found H.R. Geiger's works, right? And like if you go back and look at his works, there's one in particular that he had actually created before this film had even been released, and I can't remember what it's called now, but it's effectively like the alien creature, like a picture of it in and of itself.
Interesting.
So no, sorry, I found it. So it's called H.R. Geiger. The main point of art that was actually what completely inspired the artistic style of this, and they actually like hired H.R. Geiger to help with the alien imaging and everything, and the set design and everything. It was his painting called Necronom 4.
I think I've seen that painting.
Yeah,
I was just looking at it actually.
Yeah. A lot of the ideas came from him in that sense, and they actually really like focused on writing around the alien and designing the alien, designing those sets to the point where like the actual actors, the cast actually became like a very secondary idea. They just kind of like wrote in these characters to the point where they actually like didn't even consider the sex of the characters. They were just like, let's make all these characters unisex. Whoever we find is the best representation of each of these characters.
Interesting. They were just like roles. Character 1, character 2, character 3.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like that's where we almost got lucky in a sense that Sigourney Weaver got to star in this movie. Like this isn't, I would say, a traditionally male or female role, which is part of why this movie is also so successful, right?
Yeah, I mean that's why, she became kind of like a female action movie icon.
Yeah.
I mean, shit, you ask your average film goer who's a great female action hero, they'll usually go to Ripley right away.
I think that as well, like they thought of all of the problems of like, okay, well, we want this, and this to happen, and how is it going to work? Because so Dan O'Bannon said at some point, or this is one of the other screenwriters saying this at one point, that the problem was that they were struggling with in writing this is how to get the creature onto the ship. And they were like, if we can figure out an effective way to write this in, then then we have our movie. So the screenwriter Ron Shusett, one of the writers who touched up this the screenplay, he came up with the idea that in his words, the alien screws one of them. It jumps on his face and plants its seed.
Yep. I mean, hey, that is not inaccurate.
Stuff like that. Like, they really, really thought about how this alien was going to interact with the cast and crew, and like how the different like art style and direction of that was going to impact the crew, rather than building a cast of characters and hitting plot points and stuff like that maybe as a primary, focus of the movie. I think what the other part of this movie that makes it shine as well is that it's almost like a love letter to movies and fiction that came before it, in a sense that like it heavily takes from some of the greatest sci-fi literature and movies of like the 40s and 50s, right?
I think there's that great quote by Santa where he says, like, I didn't steal from anyone, I stole from everyone.
Yeah.
I was actually just having a conversation with an old friend from high school recently, and like he's looking to get more into writing, and I'm, working away on different projects. And we talked about how, like, we think all young writers go through this phase where they feel like every idea they have has to be wholly original.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very liberating when you get a little older and you just can decide, oh, I can just steal shit. No, seriously. Like, I made a joke to this friend. I'm like, I almost feel like all of fiction is like this grocery store. And when I'm working on a new project, I've got my shopping cart and I'm like, I want some of this, I want some of this, and I want some of this.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
And that doesn't make me a dirty thief. I mean, it does. But like, Brandon Sanderson has this great quote where he says, all stories are just remixes.
Right.
Yeah,
no, for sure. And like, this is maybe one of the greatest remixes of all time. The thing is this isn't even the first case of this, right? Like Star Wars, for example, a movie that...
Oh my God. I mean, I think Star Wars, even the term Sith was stolen from like the John Carter short stories in the 20s.
Right, yeah. And it's a play on samurai movies like Seven Samurai.
Mm-hmm.
It's a play on Westerns. Like, it's a mishmash of all of the movies and like exciting stories that came before it, right?
Just everything George Lucas liked. He just put in his movie.
Exactly. And like, on the note of Star Wars as well, like without Star Wars, we probably wouldn't have gotten this movie. Like, Star Wars came out in 1977, and this movie, the script of it was kind of bouncing around Hollywood and Dan O'Bannon's mind before that, but it really wasn't until the success of Star Wars that they greenlit a movie like this.
Yeah.
So sometimes you are the pioneer of a genre, and sometimes you just get to ride on the coattails of a success of somebody else's genre.
It happens.
Yeah.
It certainly happens.
I couldn't believe this. So we haven't mentioned that there was an actor named Bolaji Badejo who was 6'10", who was actually the alien and inside of the alien costume the entire time.
Wow.
This is the actual only role that he had ever.
Yeah.
But they found him, and he was perfect because he was so tall and so lanky.
He was Slender Man.
Yeah, he was essentially Slender Man, and so that kind of fit into the alien's design, that it was almost inhuman in its size, right, compared to everybody else. But
that's a bit too tall. That's a little terrifying.
Anything above about 6'5" is a bit too tall.
Yeah, you're like, what the fuck is that?
Yeah, but even like the head of the alien had 900 moving parts inside of it.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, like it's wild, like the design of that. Like I'm pretty sure you can read like an entire novel probably about how much thought and design went into just creating this functioning head, and like the tongue and the face within the face, right?
By the way, can you imagine you're just some very tall kid at a bar and a producer comes up to you, is like, hey kid, you want to be a star? Yeah.
It's all I've ever asked for, Michael.
Yeah, really.
And then the light effects of the egg chamber. So I already mentioned that's one of those cool little like effects parts of the movies. They actually borrowed lasers from the English band The Who were filming a music video in the lot next to them. And so they kind of got lucky and were like, can we borrow those for a day?
And I guess the director's like, yeah, just bring them back.
Yeah. How it always works.
That's really funny.
Oh, I mentioned before, like how everyone was cast unisex. There's some really cool like tidbits online about how character or how people were decided upon, like who got picked who. And I think, for our audience, maybe or maybe not what the interest is. The only thing that I wanted to mention, there's two items. First, that Meryl Streep was primarily considered for the role of Ripley.
I did see that.
Which is very interesting. I think that would have completely changed Meryl Streep's career trajectory as well.
Almost feels like it wouldn't work, but it probably would have worked. It would have just been very different,
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think that like a character or an actress like Meryl Streep, who's like, probably one of the most famous actresses of all time, or probably one of the most famous living actresses.
Oh yeah, I mean everybody loves Meryl Streep, right?
Exactly,
yeah.
right?
Wasn't there like a BoJack Horseman joke where someone pitched the idea of Meryl Streep directing, and someone was like, "Why would Meryl Streep want to direct an actor that isn't Meryl Streep?"
It's so true though, but yeah. So the other thing that I think is endlessly fascinating about this movie is that the role that Veronica Cartwright ended up in was not what she had actually auditioned for. Like, she auditioned for the role of Ripley. She thought she had the role of Ripley, and Sigourney Weaver was a very late addition to this movie, and she showed up and found out that she wasn't actually Ripley, that she was going to be playing Lambert, a character that she absolutely despised because of the nature of her character complaining the whole movie.
Well, Lambert just screams a lot.
Yeah. But she did it, so here we are now, which is slightly unfortunate for her because, like, if she was in the role of Ripley, she probably would have gone on to have maybe potentially a career more akin to, like, Sigourney Weaver. Like, some of it's just luck, like that. I think.
Well, and I don't know. You look at Lambert and you look at Sigourney Weaver, and, like, I don't know. Like, Sigourney Weaver was just the better choice, I guess.
Yeah, I think so as well. Like, she has more, like, well, and this is the performance that Veronica Cartwright was provided with Lambert, but, like, there's a lot more nuance to Sigourney Weaver's character, and she's got, like, more charisma in this role, and she pops more on screen, right?
I think a lot of it comes down to just physicality. You know what I mean? Like, Sigourney Weaver just looks sturdier, I guess.
Yeah,
or like
that's a
maybe
good way to put it. Yeah,
taller, lankier. Just
yeah.
I don't know. It's so interesting. I remember my friend Xavier going to a casting director once, and Xavier's a pretty good-looking guy, and the casting director was really friendly. And I might be getting this story wrong, so I'm sorry, Xavier, if you're listening. But, like, the casting director's like, "Oh, you're just kind of like a generic good-looking guy, Like, it's gonna be hard to find roles for you." So yeah,
the film rehearsals. They just shot the film rehearsals and maybe did like one extra shot of each scene, basically, because they wanted to, like, capture the tension between the cast. Like, the cast weren't, I don't think, all friends either making this movie, so I think some of that plays into them kind of figuring out each other. And, like, because this movie is a bunch of characters not really fully grasping everything going on around them, and, like, there's ambiguity and, like, nobody really knows what's happening, like, I think that is one of the strengths of the direction of the movie.
It's funny how sometimes when, like, cast members don't get along, it just makes for a better movie.
Yeah,
like how what's his face, Tom Hardy and
I knew you were gonna bring that one up.
Yeah, Tom Hardy and Clarice Theron legendarily argued a lot while filming Fury Road.
That is one way to put it, for sure.
Yep, there you go. That's why I'm here.
And then a couple of, like, other effects that I thought were really cool. Ridley Scott and the cinematographer's kids, they actually used and were actors in the movie. They put them in the astronaut outfits and then had them actually leaving and approaching the spaceship to make the spaceship look larger and more imposing.
Well, hey, that's clever, though. I mean, that's what you did before CG. You just had to make it work.
Well, and again, that's practical versus CGI, right? Like, I will always take practical effects over CGI. Even if the practical effects sometimes don't, like, hold up 100%, I'd still rather them over CGI.
Yeah, right? I mean, I can imagine Ridley Scott smoking a cigarette, like, just get me a couple kids. We'll put them in
his
spacesuits. Yeah. Kids, you're coming to work with Dad today.
Yeah. Pretty sure he's British, but you can try that on the next attempt.
Oh, kids, you're coming to work with Dad today.
That was Australian.
Yeah, I'm not. I apparently have a blind spot today.
You were just talking about Mad Max, so I'll give you that. Oh, a scene that was cut from the movie, which ended up having a slight appearance later on. So later in the film, there was a scene that was filmed and shot and edited, and then last minute cut was where Dallas and Brett had actually been potted for consumption and breeding of the aliens, and actually Dallas at that point was still alive and coherent as he was being consumed.
Yikes.
And so there was supposed to be a scene late in the movie where Ridley actually happens upon them as she's trying to make her escape and has a conversation with Dallas, but they ended up cutting it because it didn't really fit the pacing of the movie. Like the end of the movie, like, you know, like it's the excitement of them her trying to get off before the ship blows up, and at first she's stopped by the alien, she goes back and then has to then run back to the shuttle to get back on before the ship blows up.
Yeah.
And that really like kind of just halts everything if she has to stop and have a conversation.
It's unfortunate, but sometimes you have to like murder your darlings just to keep things moving, you know?
And I think that, you know, like we've already had so many cool ideas in this movie that they didn't need that, and they then get to use it later in Aliens, right?
Yeah. There's a legendarily deleted subplot in Aliens that we can talk about next week.
Ooh.
That I actually think was better cut.
Yeah.
I agree with the decision to cut it.
Well, and on the note of cutting this as well, like so that was cut originally, and then Ridley Scott actually about 15, 20 years ago released a director's cut. And again, quotations on the director's cut of this one.
Okay.
But he was basically commissioned for one of the anniversaries of this movie to make a director's cut version. But Ridley Scott, who has famously edited some of his other movies and re-released director's cuts,
Oh my God, he sure has.
actually considers the 1979 version to be the perfect version of this movie.
Interesting.
And so the director's cut of this movie, he actually only cut 5 minutes of this movie and added 4 minutes into this movie. So we lost a minute of it in the director's cut. But he actually considers the original version to be the director's cut of the movie, and the director's cut to be more of like a, you know, here you go, like here's something extra that you can enjoy.
Here's a little more.
Yeah.
Don't
like,
say I didn't do nothing for you.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what it was, right?
That's really funny considering how many times he tampered with Blade Runner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. You know, other directors of his time period, like George Lucas, tampering with stuff. It's funny to hear like a director being like, you know what, I nailed it the first time. Here's extra, but like really you should go watch the original
I
cut.
do respect that. It's like, nah, I got it right the first time. Like,
Yeah.
don't worry about it.
Yeah,
Like,
well, and that's part of what he said. Like, I was reading the quote about it, and he was basically like, you know, I was watching the old scenes and like deciding if I wanted to add what I wanted to add, and he was like, no, like all of this stuff, like I had a reason for cutting then, and I still agree with my reasoning for cutting it now.
Yeah, no, I respect that a lot.
Yeah.
There's a larger debate on whether or not directors should have the ability to go in and change things if they want, but that's a conversation for another day. Maybe when we inevitably do Star Wars, we will talk about that, because there are so many different versions floating around.
Oh my God.
And some of them are just, some of the changes are just so fucking dumb.
It's pretty much impossible nowadays to get like the original version of Star Wars.
Yeah, you almost need to like bootleg it, you know what I mean?
I don't even know if you can get a bootlegged version of it. Like,
Or you need to find like an old VHS tape floating around.
even the VHS might have been CG altered at that point in time. Like, I'm talking like Star Wars is one of those movies that has been edited and tampered with so long and so many times that I legitimately think I think there are people who have gone back and like digitally unedited what was digitally added, and then digitally added what their thought of what the original had in it.
You know what's
almost.
tragic? I remember having the VHS tapes when I was a kid, but they were the special edition tapes.
Yeah.
So I don't think I've ever even seen
I don't think many people have.
the original unaltered version.
Unless you were there in like 7 when it was released. Like,
Yeah, it's almost like some old man at like a bar, like, I remember the good times
Yeah.
when Luke's lightsaber was a pale blue and Han shot first.
I mean, I'm sure in some vault somebody has like the old like movie reels of that film.
Oh, I'm
right?
sure
Which would
someone
have it,
has it somewhere.
which would be cool to like if they ever did like a tour of that around like old indie theaters, like that would be a must watch. But
You know what's funny? When George Lucas, if he decided to re-release the original untampered with versions,
Yeah.
people would go apeshit.
oh my God, yeah.
People would lose their fucking minds.
Yeah. All right, getting back on the rails of Alien. Look back at the times. So I honestly, there's a couple notes of this. I want to highlight first the movie poster one of the most iconic movie posters of all time.
Oh, for sure.
We already mentioned it, but what I actually had never even thought about until doing my research into this was the fact that the alien egg on the alien poster is just like a chicken egg or a duck egg or something like that. It actually doesn't look at all like the egg in the movie.
Wait, what the fuck? Really?
Yeah. So at that point in time, they actually reshot, like they went back in post and reshot the egg inspection scene. So originally the shots they just used were just hen's eggs, and then that ended up in the trailer. It was the original shot of the eggs, and then as well the egg was actually put on the poster as well. But the egg on the poster is significantly different from the egg in the movie.
How have I never noticed
Like
that?
I said, I didn't notice that either until I was doing my research, and I was like, mind blown.
I guess it's maybe there's that like green shit coming out of it, so that's where your eye is naturally drawn to.
Yeah.
I admire that confidence though, of just throw it on the poster, no one will notice.
It looks sick, bro.
It does look
Just
sick.
put it on there. Just put it on. Just trust me. Just
Is
trust
that
me.
your Ridley Scott impression? Like,
Yeah.
it looks sick, bro. People are gonna love it, bro.
I guarantee Ridley Scott didn't look at the poster once before it was released.
Probably not. No, I mean the way marketing departments and directors communicate sometimes.
Yeah. And then, like, when it was released released at really mixed critical reception. Although people, like, went to this movie in droves.
Oh yeah.
And were genuinely terrified by this movie. I've read lots of like quotes online about people and how this movie inspired them to get into like filmmaking, how this movie completely blew their minds when it came out.
You know what's funny? My mom watched this movie with me a few days ago, and I asked her, I'm like, "Have you ever seen this movie before?" She's like, "I saw it in theaters, and then I stopped going to see horror movies."
Everything about it just came together so well that it's one of those movies that I wish I was there for it kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, shit, it would be Star Wars, Rocky, and this that I would go back to the 70s and watch.
I've just lent you the Quentin Tarantino book about movies in the 70s, but I would have loved to have been alive in the 70s to watch all of these.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then over time, like the critical reception of this obviously was changed. Like Roger Ebert was famously pretty mixed on this one originally, and it eventually did make it onto his great movies list.
Yeah. I mean, I've said this before. You gotta hand it to Roger. He wasn't afraid to revise his opinion.
Yeah. This actually did win like an Oscar even at the time. Like even despite the mixed critical reception, it did win Best Visual Effects and was nominated for Best Art Direction.
Interesting.
Even despite it coming out and having the mixed initial reception, it was recognized as like a major achievement at that time, and then has gone on to become like one of the most famous movies of all time. And on that note, like personal reviews and the partner factor, what do you think of the movie Alien?
I liked it quite a bit. And again, it's funny. I didn't really think I would enjoy this movie going into it because I'm not always partial to slower paced movies, and I'm not always partial to sci-fi itself, but I had a really good time.
Well, and part of it as well, like again, reading online, the analysis of this movie, like this is one of the most analyzed movies of all time. The analysis of this movie is that really the sci-fi elements of this take a backseat to the horror and some of the deeper thematic elements. At this point in time, sci-fi was often used as like a cinematic visual crutch sometimes in storytelling. And this one just let that kind of just live in the background and let the story of these characters and their plight like play out in front of us. But I agree with you. Like, I'm a big fan of this movie. At one point in time, it was it's probably still in my top 100, but it's moved down a little bit from when I first saw this. I've watched a lot of movies. Like, this was one of those, again, rite of passage movies for me when I was late teens, starting to really get into movies. I watched this one and was like, oh my god, this is maybe the greatest movie ever made. And like since then, it's still in my top 100. It is objectively one of the greatest movies ever made, but I've definitely have a few other sci-fi movies that I like a little bit more than this one, and there's some horror movies that I like a little bit more than this one. But I don't know if there's many sci-fi horror movies that I like more than this one. There's pretty much, like, if we go pure sci-fi horror, like, maybe The Thing is really the only one. And that's, like...
I was thinking about The Thing a lot while watching this.
Yeah. Very comparable movies, right? Because
yeah.
they're both claustrophobic, like, aliens versus remote employees, basically.
Yeah, I actually think The Thing is definitely scarier.
Yeah.
I think I told you I actually watched it last October for the second time and enjoyed it way more the second time.
Right.
But no, this might be my favorite. Well, I can't say it's my favorite Ridley Scott movie, but because that's probably Gladiator, but it's up there.
Yeah.
Like I
agree.
liked it way more than Blade Runner.
What I'm excited for is I haven't watched this and Aliens back to back in a long time.
Yeah.
And so I'm really excited, and I don't want you to spoil your thoughts on Aliens versus this movie quite yet,
Oh,
but
I won't then.
but I'm really interested for myself to rewatch Aliens because like you said, they're drastically different movies.
Insanely different movies. And again, that's just even just from like a a cultural perspective, that's so interesting. It'd be like so Casablanca is like a film noir drama period piece. It'd be funny if it's like Casablanca 2 was like a sci-fi thriller where they're shooting Nazis with machine guns. I don't know, like whatever.
Like any
Or if
sequel.
like the second season of Dawson's Creek was like, we give all those teenagers guns and they go shooting monsters in the woods. I don't know. I'm just spitballing ideas out there.
I don't know if any of these ideas are going to get picked up, but if they do, we get copyright on them.
Cha-ching. Subscribe to our Patreon.
Yeah, I think we have talked for a long time about Alien and about our appreciation of this movie and just how incredibly well made it is. So I think that we could probably wrap it up here, and we will next week talk about Aliens in a spoiler-free context of that as well. I'm really looking forward to watching it again. Is definitely one of my favorites of all time, and we'll see again which one I end up watching. Part of it is as well with like Alien and Aliens, because they're such different movies, they're also like for different moods and different times, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
So,
and it's especially interesting seeing how the Ripley character evolves through the two movies.
Yeah.
For there are only two movies. I haven't seen any of the other ones except for the first two. Maybe they're not that bad.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen Alien and Aliens, and I've seen Prometheus. So I've only seen 3 of about 7. I haven't even watched the Alien vs. Predator movies, although I've only ever seen Predator, but I've watched the first Predator movie like 3-4 times.
I saw Predators with Adrian Brody.
Really?
I was at a bar once and somebody told me I looked like Adrian Brody. And I was kind of like, all right.
In like the slightest resemblance, maybe.
Maybe. I had hair at the time, so maybe
okay.
that would throw people off.
True, fair enough. When you have long hair, people just kind of like say you look like people a lot.
With long hair.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. It's just like a thing. It's like, oh, you grow your hair out. You must be going for this.
You must be going for
always
this.
Jeff Bridges.
For you, maybe. For me, it was Loki.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, that's it. Let's see you next time. As always, tell your dad.
Oh, before we stop, I had a factoid I wanted to share. Do you know what the working title of this movie was?
No.
Star Beast.
I did see that.
Yeah.
To rip off Star Wars.
Ah.
Yeah.
So imagine if they'd gone with that. Then the sequel would have been called Star Beasts.
Star Beast, spooky.
Star Beast 3, and then Star Beast versus Predator.
Before we even get into Aliens is maybe like one of the best sequel names of all time as well.
It's pretty funny.
It's just like, rather than do Alien 2, which kind of, feels more like direct sequel, Aliens just really captures like how different these two movies are.
It works on multiple different levels.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah. More on that next time.
Also, you can cut this out if you want. I don't care. But like, I really just like the title of this movie too. It's so simple.
Yeah.
Just Alien. It's great.
It's short and it's to the point, just like this movie is.
Someday I'm going to write a fantasy novel called Sword.
All right.
Okay.
That's it. See you.
Tell your dad.